chapter 9, Barbarisms, Crude Laws, and Other Imaginary Crimes. The goal basically for today is we're going to be looking at, as you can imagine from the title, a bunch of laws that new atheists view as barbaric, as morally primitive, and my modest goal for today, hopefully I can over-accomplish, is to place these punishments, these laws, the harsh realities into perspective, okay? So we start with a bit of recap, which we've covered in other videos, so like and subscribe, okay? And the first thing that we've already been over is that the Old Testament laws reflected the ancient Near Eastern context. They weren't issued in a vacuum. In many ways, life in the ancient Near East was like the state of nature described by philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Nasty, brutish, and short. Okay? It should not be terribly surprising then when we discover that some of the laws that we read, the Mosaic laws, reflect that. The Copan quote that I keep going back to is, Israel's Old Testament covenant wasn't a universal ideal, and it was never intended to be so. The Mosaic laws should be viewed as incremental steps for hardened hearts. The illustration Copan gives is like two sides of a coin. We have human hard-heartedness, and then on the other side, divine forbearance. We can extrapolate what Jesus said to the Pharisees about divorce to many other aspects, which is, what did Jesus say? Well, Moses permitted this. He didn't command this. He permitted this because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it was not so. So when the new atheists refer to some of these laws that we're going to be discussing, right, as barbarisms, crude, etc., we can actually understand where they're coming from for some of these. To our modern ears, the law of Moses, with all of its death penalty and harsh punishments, does seem to be overly severe at times. But acknowledging that, can it also be that at least on some occasions, it's we, modern people, our modern sensibilities that are wrong, that need to be refined? In 2011, a man murdered 77 people at a summer camp in Norway. Okay. Anyone want to guess his sentence? Death? 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence in Norway for any crime. Yep. Anyone want to do the math real quick? Anyone interested? How many months, because it's not even a year, obviously, how many months per person murdered? Good, Gabby, you're close. 3.27 months per person murdered. 3.27 months. It was mixed, but if the Old Testament laws, my point is, if the Old Testament laws can be faulted for being too harsh, I think the pendulum can swing too much the other way, right? I certainly find the Norway's laws unjust for being too lenient. Recently, there was a 20-year-old Ukrainian refugee who was fatally stabbed on a train. Most of us are familiar with this story. News sources say that the guy who stabbed her had been arrested at least 14 times on charges including felony larceny, armed robbery, assault, making threats, etc. He was in prison for 5 years, and when he was released, did he change his ways? A converted man? No, he continued committing crimes. He was a career criminal. So much for our progressive society, right? We show compassion to criminals, and then the victims pay the tab. One final note, right, is that the Mosaic law represents a significant improvement over ancient Near Eastern law codes. So, having acknowledged that, yes, some of them are harsh because it represents the context they were in. Also having taken a step back and saying, maybe on some of these, it's our sensibilities, our intuitions, the ones that are wrong. The other thing that we need to be cognizant of is we need to compare the Mosaic laws with the other laws when they were given. Although, of course, we can note parallels, what should really surprise us between the Mosaic law and ancient Near Eastern laws are the whopping differences that exist between the two. The fact that the Mosaic law represents remarkable legal and moral advances. Let me share with you, I think, an insight that I learned from Dennis Prager that illustrates this nicely. So in high school was when I first kind of started thinking about politics, and I realized that my teachers definitely had political agendas. They were not just there to teach me, okay? And as an immigrant, okay, having come to this country because my dad obviously, my family thought it was going to be better than Cuba, and it is, okay? But then I'm at school, and all I hear about America is that it's a terrible place, that it's systemically racist. They'll even use religious terminology. They'll say that slavery is America's original sin. They're not believers, but they'll use religious terminology when it comes to America. Dennis Prager says, okay, of course, we can acknowledge that America has done bad things, specifically, evil things, slavery. But what needs to be explained, what should shock us or marvel us, is not, that America, that we practiced slavery, since that was true of virtually every society, but that we were one of the first to abolish slavery as an institution. I think the same thing applies to the Mosaic laws. Really, what should be marveled at is not the fact that some of those things were harsh, because, well, look at the context. What should marvel us is that some of those laws reflect moral thinking that is thousands of years ahead of its time. Okay? With that said, that's basically what we're going to be doing now with these laws. We're going to be looking at laws, and we're going to be highlighting the difference between the Mosaic laws and other ancient Near Eastern laws. So let's start with Sabbath breakers and slanderers. Numbers 15:32 through 36. While the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found the man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses. If you read the verses immediately preceding this passage, you're going to find a discussion about unintentional sins versus high-handed sins. And if you're like, what the heck is a high-handed sin? Well, it's basically to commit a sin knowingly and deliberately. But if that still doesn't make sense to you, what we just read is supposed to be an illustration of a high-handed sin. What I mean by that is that the Sabbath requirement was well known in Israel. So when this man violated the Sabbath law, he knew the consequences, okay? But let me go ahead and read that passage. Exodus 32:12 through 17. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. One thing is pretty clear. The guy knew what he was doing. Okay, he knew the punishment for violating the Sabbath. But if you're a keen reader, okay, you'll notice that the verses we just read give two reasons why, although, let me rephrase it. Sometimes, okay, we can find these laws to be overtly harsh, specifically the Sabbath one, because we don't understand the value that the Sabbath had to the Israelites. About a week ago, I was sitting with a friend, and I was trying to reconcile two parties that are at war with each other. And so I was explaining to my friend, sometimes what happens is we subjectively value something a lot, okay? And what happens is we attach a very high value to something, but the other person doesn't know that we are attaching the value to that. And so what happens is when the other person doesn't meet our expectations, and so then there's that disconnect between reality and our expectations, what follows is unhappiness. We feel let down. We feel disappointed by that person. And all we needed to have done was to exteriorize, to express the fact that, hey, although it might not look it to you, this has a lot of value to me. And well, once you say that, if your friend or spouse or whatever doesn't care, well, that's on them, okay? But you see, I think the same thing can go for the Sabbath. These verses mention two reasons why the Sabbath was so important for the Israelites. Were you able to catch them? Start thinking about it. The first is that the Sabbath was the sign of the old covenant. Okay, it was the most important rite for the Israelites. Hence why it's the only ritual observance in the 10 Commandments. The Sabbath reminded the Israelites that they could take a day off of work because they were no longer slaves. Can slaves take a day off of work? No, but free people can. Okay, God had delivered them from slavery in Egypt. And the Sabbath was supposed to be a reminder, a sign, an external ritual that reminded them of their covenant with God. Moreover, observing the Sabbath was an affirmation that God created the universe. If you go back and read the verses, you'll see that that's pretty clear. Just like God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, the Israelites were told, work 6 days and rest on the seventh. Thus, by publicly violating the Sabbath, what the stick gatherer was doing was undermining one of the most fundamental teachings of the Bible, that God is the creator of heaven and earth. So, why was Sabbath breaking a grave religious offense? Well, because it violated one of the 10 Commandments, and because it was a denial of God as creator. But Copan actually gives us another perspective. If the Israelites knew that working on the Sabbath that if someone worked on the Sabbath, he was to be put to death. What do we make of verse 34? Verse 34 says, because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. Well, Copan plausibly stipulates that besides being an illustration of defiant sin, what's happening here is that we have a first-time violation of the law. The Israelites knew the law, but they were unsure about how to apply it because it had never come into play. If you think that's silly, think again, because a man's life is hanging in the balance. Okay, they were like, whoa, we know God said, imagine, think about it. God commands you to kill someone if they violate the Sabbath. Okay? If there's a violation, you want to make sure, God, did you really say this? God tells us to do simple, silly things all the time, and we're always like, God, are you really telling me to do this? Are you really telling me to give $5 in the offering plate? Okay, so imagine this. They value human life. So they're like, okay, this is a first-time application. Let's see what God has to say. And well, it turns out God was serious. Okay, yeah, put him to death. Copan says, especially in exemplary or first-time cases, God seems especially heavy-handed. He takes sin seriously, and he is often setting a precedent with first-time offenses. Just think of Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament, okay? It seems harsh, but think. They were struck dead, right, for lying about how generous they were. But this, although it seems harsh, the message wasn't lost on the early church. Quote, great fear came over the whole church and over all who heard of these things. Acts 5:11. Likewise, except for the guy who right, the stick gatherer on the Sabbath, there is actually no other record of anyone being put to death for breaking the Sabbath. It seems like they too got the message loud and clear. To borrow from the next law we're going to look at, the point was for all Israel to hear of it and be afraid. Which leads us to our next law. The glutton and the drunkard. Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21. If someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Let's break down the law, the offense. Let's start with a description of the son. Okay? Before, there's this funny story. When I was preparing, this funny story came to mind. And it's an illustration about a disobedient son. And it's basically, there's a story of a mother who wanted to have the last word. Stephanie knows the story. But couldn't handle the hassle that resulted whenever she said no to her young son. Basically throw a tantrum every time he was told no. After an especially trying day, she finally flung up her hands and shouted, all right, Billy, do whatever you want. Now let me see you disobey that. Do I have to explain it? Okay. I was okay. I guess you guys didn't find it funny. When we break this down, you're going to realize that not even a brat such as Billy would have been affected by this law. Here's what I mean. Let's look at the flattering adjectives and descriptors used of this son. He's stubborn and rebellious. He's disobedient to both father and mother. He's unwilling to listen. He's a glutton and a drunkard and an evil among you. Okay? So the son is not a little hoodlum. He's not a little prankster or teenager who's in a rebellious stage, who won't clean up his room. No, it's a son whose insubordinate behavior can't be corrected. Despite everyone's best efforts, he's a repeat offender. How about glutton and drunkard? Okay. This could mean that he was a glutton and drunkard, but what it actually probably means is because glutton and drunkard in biblical speech and biblical idiom is actually a stand-in for a life of wastefulness and irresponsibility. Distinct to the New Testament. What do the Pharisees accuse Jesus of? Being a glutton and a drunkard. Okay, it was an insult, basically. Copan goes further, and he posits that the son's behavior would have a destructive effect on the family and wider community. Namely, the son was probably a firstborn who would squander his inheritance when his father died, thereby likely bringing to ruin his present and future family, since the firstborn son would receive a double portion of the inheritance. Where did Copan get this from? He actually doesn't say, but there's this thing called the immediate context. And you'd be surprised at how helpful it is. Okay, I'm obviously being sarcastic. If you look at the immediate preceding law, Deuteronomy 21, 15 through 17, guess what it's about? It's about protecting the rights of firstborn sons, the inheritance, even if he's the son of an unloved wife. So, back then, they could have, they weren't supposed to have multiple wives, but they did so anyways. And naturally, you're going to love some wives more than others. And what if your firstborn son, who you're supposed to give a double portion of your inheritance, is from one of those wives that you don't really like that much? The inclination, the tendency would be to be like, psych, right? I'm going to give it to this other son with this other wife that I have that I like better. This law prohibited that. But then, the law we just read at the beginning then was a counterbalance to this. Yes, we're going to protect the firstborn son's inheritance, but the firstborn son can't act like a complete buffoon, okay? He can't live an insubordinate and rebellious life with impunity. And obviously, the son's behavior is a violation of the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Right? There's a lot of back and forth. People have a lot of opinions. Well, what does it mean to honor your father and mother? If anything was dishonoring father and mother, it was the son's behavior. Okay? Another thing that is worth mentioning about the law is the fact that there needed to be parental agreement. Quote, his father and mother shall take hold of him. Quote, this son of ours. So this couldn't just be a case of parental favoritism where, let's say, a mom wanted to get rid of this son that she didn't like that much or was troublesome, or, fathers are more prone to anger issues. This couldn't be a case where a father got really pissed off at his son. He was like, all right, I've had it with this kid. Let me go so that they stone him. Okay? No. Both parents had to agree that this child was beyond their control. And the last thing, the last safeguard, is community involvement. Quote, bring him to the elders at the gate of his town, and quote, all the men of his town are to stone him to death. The son had to be tried by a court of elders and be found guilty. So the mom and dad have to agree. They have to bring him before the elders, who function basically as a court. They had to take the case and find him guilty, and even beyond that, then all the men of the town had to stone the boy, which implies that the boy's behavior was so egregious that all the men in the town would be willing to stone him. Listen to what Dennis Prager has to say about how this law represents a moral advancement. He says that the Torah in this law was thousands of years ahead of its time. For, quote, it forbade parents from ever killing their children, as was the parental prerogative in much of the ancient world, and remains so in parts of the world today. In case you guys didn't know, tragically, there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of such deaths each year where parents just get their children and out of rage, mainly in majority Muslim cultures, they call them honor killings. And because supposedly the girl brought some shame into the family, they get her and just execute her. You see how different this is? Let's move on to the third law. Mediums, sorcerers, and false prophets. Leviticus 20:27. A man or woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads. In other words, those who dedicated themselves to predicting the future through omens or signs, fortune telling, and attempting to contact spiritual, which we know are demonic beings, were outlawed. In a democratic society such as ours, this sounds really intolerant. Okay, our Constitution guarantees and enshrines our freedom of religion. To be more precise, right, the First Amendment guarantees that the government cannot infringe on our free exercise of religion unless it demonstrates a compelling governmental interest pursued through the least restrictive means available. Basically, what that means is that they can't violate your exercise of religion unless they have a really good reason to do so. Okay? But Israel wasn't a constitutional republic like us. The supreme law of the land for us is our Constitution. What was the supreme law of the land for them? The covenant. Okay, whatever God said. It was a theocracy. Israel had bound herself to Yahweh, right? Like we've said it before, like a husband to a wife. Well, like a wife to a husband, because I said Israel. They had willingly submitted to God's theocratic rule. And witchcraft is a big no-no, okay? You shall have no other gods before me. And we know that in the New Testament, Paul makes it very clear that although sometimes these practices may seem innocuous, like there's nothing wrong with them, Paul says behind idols, behind witchcraft, behind all these things are real spiritual beings, demons opposed to God. Okay? If you've been paying attention to our world lately, or I don't know if it's just my personal experience, but there has been a huge resurgence of like witchcraft, fortune telling, angel numbers, etc., etc. Two of my high school friends who are professing Christians are now New Age, tarot card reading, horoscope believing gals. Okay? There is a catchy paraphrase of G.K. Chesterton that goes, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing. He believes in anything. And I think that's very true. Now we'll move on to an eye for an eye. Exodus 21:23 through 25. But if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay. Copan says this was not to be taken literally. Okay, there's a lot of misunderstanding around this law, and I think in huge part that's why it gets such a bad rap. Okay, We'll talk about that a little more now. But he says it's not to be taken literally. The only part of lex talionis, this is the proper name for the law, lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, lex talionis, okay? That was taken literally was life for life. For Scripture repeatedly calls for the execution of people who murder others, okay? The biblical witness across Scripture for premeditated murder, put to death. Yet, in passages involving personal injuries, we see that justice required monetary compensation, not bodily mutilation. Let me try to simplify this. The law says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right? All of these things. The only time the Israelites took that literally as is was life for life, and that's because that was a consistent witness across Scripture. When it came to personal injuries, and we read the passages, they said, okay, this happened to your hand, let's find monetary compensation. They didn't interpret this law as saying, okay, we got to cut your hand in precisely the same way that he cut your hand. First, that's kind of silly. That's almost impractical. But they didn't even interpret it that way anyways. And Copan says, this is because the point of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc., is that the punishment should fit the crime. It was a measure of justice stating that the penalties, that the punishment needed to be proportional. Okay? Properly understood, I think few people would object to this principle. And the reason why I say this is because this is one of the cornerstone pillars that goes behind our sentencing in our legal system. We just call it something different. We call it the principle of proportionality, right? If you did something that wasn't that terrible, you shouldn't get the death penalty. Okay, we all intuitively understand that. And that's what lex talionis is telling us. Conversely, right, I think it should be proportionate so that when a man murders 77 people, perhaps he should get more than 21 years. It doesn't seem very proportionate there, okay? Biblical scholar Brevard Childs says about the lex talionis principle that it marked an important advance and was far from being a vestige from a primitive age. I hope you can see why lex talionis is a moral advancement over other ancient cultures' morality, but let me just list a few reasons. The first one is that it's a statement of human equality. The poor, the rich, no matter what social class, would get the same punishment as everyone else. Compare this to the Code of Hammurabi, okay, which some people say, oh, look, no, the Code of Hammurabi also had lex talionis, so the Bible was not unique. Okay, let's look at their so-called lex talionis. If a man has destroyed the eye of a man of equal rank, they shall destroy his eye. If he has destroyed the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. What a beautiful lex talionis. Okay. First, they actually required literal mutilation, as you can see. Take his eye out. And second, there was only proportionality when it was amongst aristocrats or a man of equal status. But if it's a commoner, who cares? Just pay him some money. Okay. Under lex talionis, Dennis Prager says, no one's eye is worth more than the eye of anyone else. Another reason why it presents a moral advancement is that it prohibited unjust revenge. Guys, let's be honest. What's the natural human instinct when someone does something to us? We don't want just justice. We don't want to exactly give that other person what that person deserves. if one of our tires is slashed, we want to slash at least 2 tires. Okay? We want violent revenge. We want to go over because we want to teach the bum a lesson. Okay? Well, Lex Talionis prohibited this. First, because you weren't allowed to take vengeance in your own hands. You had to go to the courts. And second, because in court, the judge was only allowed to give proportionate punishment. Okay? The principle limits the compensation to the damage suffered, no more. And the third thing is that it ensured that the guilty party was punished. Again, contrast this with the Code of Hammurabi, which called for the execution of a builder's daughter if the house he built collapsed and killed the client's daughter. Let me try to simplify that. Okay. If there was a guy that builds a house, and when the other guy's family is living in it, it collapses and kills the client's daughter, guess who got the rap for his negligence, let's call it? The one who built that guy's daughter. Does that seem fair to you? Did the daughter build the house? But that's how a lot of punishments in the ancient Near East were. Oh, okay, you did this to me. Let me go ahead and kill your daughter. Okay. Let me go ahead and take it out on your family. I mean, we see this in movies all the time. We're laughing, but we haven't really advanced that much. Okay. Oh, you did this to me. I'm going to go ahead and murder your entire family. Oh, you hurt my feelings. Let me go shoot up a school. Okay. That we haven't advanced that much. Let's not pretend. But I already hear it. Do you guys hear it? The objection. But didn't Jesus say, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, and he continues, okay? What was happening here is not that Jesus was saying, oh no, Lex Talionis is garbage. Forget about it. What was happening here is that the law had been misapplied by Jesus' contemporaries as a pretext for seeking personal vengeance outside of the law courts. So they were saying, oh, you did this to me? Well, the law says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and then I'm going to get right back at you. I hope you can see how that's a misapplication. What about the famous phrase attributed to Gandhi, which he didn't say, but it represented his beliefs? An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Very catchy, and it sounds noble, doesn't it? Pacifism, nonviolence, peace and love. Okay? Well, Gandhi's commitment to pacifism also, quote, led Gandhi to recommend the Jews of Nazi-occupied Europe they not engage in or support any violent resistance to Hitler, and to recommend to the British soldiers in the spring of 1940, when Hitler seemed poised to take over Europe, to lay down their arms, not fight the Nazis, and let the Nazis occupy England. In Gandhi's own words, quote, if these gentlemen, by gentlemen he was referring to the Nazis, choose to occupy your homes, you will vacate them. If they do not give you free passage out, you will allow yourselves, man, woman, and child, to be slaughtered, but you will refuse to owe allegiance to them. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I hear this and I want to puke, okay? What cowardice. What injustice. You're going to allow people who are doing injustice to just trample over you, to murder your family, take over, invade your homeland? No. Okay, that's absolutely crazy. And now let's switch gears a bit. Some people might take these harsh punishments and, right, these talk of death penalty, as the fact that the Mosaic law had a disregard for human life. But actually, one of the major difference between Old Testament laws and their ancient Near East counterparts was that the former showed a greater regard for human life. And I think time will only allow us to give 2 examples. The first, ox goring, Exodus 21:28-30. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned, but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. You see here how they didn't interpret lex talionis literally? Payment? Okay. Dennis Prager, again, to cite him, he has a lot of interesting things to say about the Old Testament. He shares a story of a woman, excuse me, whose family raised ostriches. Okay? She told Dennis that her father had been killed by one of them. Okay? And Dennis asked, well, what, if anything, was done to that ostrich? She replied that nothing had been done. So Dennis asked, so when people visit, you just point to the ostrich and say, that's the ostrich that killed my dad. That sounds wrong, doesn't it? Thankfully, our society as a whole still employs the moral wisdom found in this law. Think about Harambe. I hit you guys out of nowhere with that one, right? Didn't I? What happened with Harambe? Poor Harambe. He was put to death. What did Harambe do? Well, Harambe, not intentionally, obviously, he was a gorilla. He killed an innocent child, okay? And why did we put Harambe to death? For the same reasoning, right, that this law was given. Because it's an affirmation of our high regard for human life as a society, okay? The point is not that the animal was morally guilty. Rather, the stoning of the animal was a public recognition of how terrible it is to kill a human being. Infant sacrifice. Contrary to the Canaanites, right, surrounding them and other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the Mosaic law clearly condemns child sacrifice as morally abhorrent. Leviticus 18:21. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Lest anyone say that the problem was just that God was jealous because they were sacrificing to Moloch and not to him. Look at the other verse. Deuteronomy 12:31. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. So, it's not a matter that he was jealous that they were sacrificing the children to other gods. No, it's that he says, you shall not worship me in this way. I find it abominable, okay, detestable. We know that going even further than the Canaanites around them, we know that child sacrifice has been pretty widely practiced across cultures until like the other day, okay? I'm thinking here of the Aztecs, okay, who would just murder thousands of people, child, adult alike, okay, in one day. in this sense, the biblical prohibition of child sacrifice was, once again, radically ahead of its time and countercultural. We don't have time to really get into this third law, although it's very interesting. And there are issues, a lot of issues here at play, and people say some things and others, but I'm just going to assume that I'm right, and because I am, okay? If you disagree with me, you're obviously wrong, okay? Exodus 21, 22 through 25. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him. And he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So putting aside all the potential objections and the ways that you can interpret this verse, assuming, okay, that we discard those, what do these verses teach about how the Bible views the unborn human life? As equal to the life of the mother. Life for life, right? As equal to the life of the offender. If something happens to that unborn child when he comes out and he dies, you're getting killed as well, okay? And I think this is obviously consistent with the teaching of Scripture in other parts. I mean, you don't have to be a theologian to know that Psalm 139 strongly supports the value of unborn life. And we're going to go ahead and conclude with these verses. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. In the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Amen.